I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I didn't even look angry. When he pushed my chair back and said, "You don't eat here anymore," I simply stood up. That's what scared them later. Because when a woman my age goes quiet, it's never because she's weak. It's because she's done explaining. My name is Margaret Holloway. I am 71 years old. I've been a widow for 9 years. And the house you're imagining right now, the brick one with the narrow porch and the maple tree out front, is mine. Not emotionally mine. Not symbolically mine. Legally mine. I bought it with my husband in 1984. I paid it off in 2009. The deed has my name on it, clean and unchallenged. And yet, for 3 years, I lived like a guest inside it. When my son, Evan, asked if he and his wife could stay for a while, I said yes, without hesitation. He'd lost his job. They were getting back on their feet. I didn't ask for rent. I didn't ask for groceries. I didn't ask how long a while meant. I told myself this is what mothers do. What I didn't realize was that kindness, when it goes on too long, starts to look like permission. At first, it was small things. My mug moved from the front cabinet to the back. My shows replaced by theirs. My quiet mornings interrupted by loud calls I wasn't meant to hear. I adjusted. Women my generation are very good at adjusting. Then one day, I realized I was eating dinner alone most nights. Not because they weren't home, but because they'd already eaten. Without asking me. The night it finally broke was a Tuesday. I remember because I'd made soup from scratch. Nothing fancy. Just something warm. I sat at the dining table, my table, and turned on the television softly. Brooke walked in first. She looked at the screen, then at my chair. "That's Evan's seat," she said. I smiled, confused. "I've always sat here." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She slid the chair back with her foot and said, "He's tired. You can eat in the kitchen." I looked at my son. He didn't look up from his phone. That silence told me everything. So I stood. I rinsed my bowl carefully, dried my hands, picked up my purse, and left. No goodbye. No confrontation. Just space. The quiet decision. I didn't drive far. I checked into a hotel downtown. I ordered tea. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at my hands. They weren't shaking. That surprised me. What surprised me more was the thought that followed. I don't have to live like this. That was the night I stopped being just a mother. That was the night I remembered I was also an owner. I opened my laptop. I printed my deed. I pulled bank statements. I reviewed utility bills, all in my name. Every payment. Every transfer. Every excuse I had made for them. By morning, I had a number. $143,600. That's what my love had cost me. The first move. I didn't warn them. I simply changed passwords, removed names, canceled services. When Brooke texted, "Internet's down. Fix it," I typed one word. No. That single word felt heavier than every check I'd ever written. The uniform. Before I faced them, I went shopping. Not because I wanted to impress anyone. Because I needed to remind myself who I was before I started apologizing for existing. I bought neutral colors. Clean lines. Nothing soft. When I looked in the mirror, I didn't see a grandmother. I saw a woman who knew how systems worked. They were angry when they saw me. Confused too. They thought I'd come to beg. Instead, I came with paper. Brooke talked about rights. Evan talked about time served. I listened. Then I slid the documents forward. No lease. No rent. No claim. And when they realized I wasn't bluffing, that I understood the law better than they ever would, the room went very quiet. The line that ended it. I looked at my son and said, "I raised a child. I did not raise a dependent." That was the first time he looked ashamed. Ending beat retention. They moved out before the deadline. The house was damaged, but reparable. Unlike boundaries, once they're broken. 6 months later, my son came back alone. He apologized without asking for anything. That's how I knew it was real. Now I eat at my table again. I control the volume. I choose who stays. And when women my age ask me how I found the courage, I tell them the truth. I didn't find it. I remembered I already had it. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. Not my sister. Not my neighbors. Not even myself out loud. Because the moment you announce a boundary, people rush in to negotiate it. I wasn't interested in negotiation. I was interested in ending a pattern. After they left the attorney's office, I didn't go home. I drove slowly. Windows down. Radio off. I realized something uncomfortable during that drive. For years, I'd been exhausted, but I couldn't explain why. It wasn't age. It was the constant pressure of being useful to people who no longer saw me as human. When I finally returned to the house that night, the lights were still on. They hadn't noticed yet. That's what happens when people believe something belongs to them. They stop paying attention. What I saw clearly for the first time. The refrigerator was packed with food I hadn't bought. The living room smelled like cologne I didn't wear. My photo frames had been moved, turned slightly, like someone didn't want to look at them. It felt less like a home and more like a space I was allowed to occupy quietly. So, I didn't unpack my bags. I stayed in the guest room that night. And in the morning, I did something that took me years to learn how to do. I stopped explaining myself. When Brooke finally realized the credit card was frozen, she didn't call.
She stormed.
"You embarrassed us," she said. "You blindsided us." I nodded slowly. "Yes," I said. "I did." She waited for me to defend myself. I didn't. That's when she got louder. People get loud when they realize guilt won't work anymore. Evan tried a different tactic. He sat down across from me like a boy again. "Mom, we're family." That word,
Family.
it had been used like a weapon for years. I folded my hands and said, "Family doesn't mean entitlement." He didn't recognize the woman in front of him. Neither did I, really. And that was the point. For days, they tried everything. Anger. Silence. Sudden politeness. Brooke cooked dinner once and asked if I wanted some. I smiled. "No," I said. "I've already eaten." That was a lie. But it was also a rehearsal. Because learning to say no after decades of yes takes practice. Late one night, I overheard them arguing. They thought I was asleep. Brooke said, "She's ruining everything." Evan said, "She's always been like this." That sentence settled something inside me. Because if this was who they thought I was, then I no longer needed to prove anything else. When the notice arrived, Brooke cried. Real tears. Not manipulation. For a moment, my chest tightened. This is where many women stop. This is where guilt reclaims control. I remembered something my husband once told me after a hard audit case. Compassion doesn't mean collapsing. So I stayed still. People assume strength feels loud. It doesn't. It feels quiet. Almost boring. I slept better those weeks than I had in years. Not because things were easy, but because they were clear. They packed loudly. Drawers slammed. Boxes dragged. Brooke didn't look at me. Evan hesitated at the door. "I didn't think it would end like this," he said. I answered honestly. "Neither did I. But it had to end sometime." He nodded. And then they were gone. Silence returned slowly. Not the empty kind. The peaceful kind. I walked through every room. Not fixing. Not cleaning. Just claiming. When I reached the dining table, I pulled the chair back into place. My place. 6 months later, my phone rang. It was Evan. His voice was different. Not defensive. Not rushed. "I got a job," he said. "I'm renting a small place." I listened. Then he said something I hadn't expected. "I didn't know how much you were carrying." That sentence mattered more than any apology. He asked if he could come for dinner sometime. I said yes. Then I added, "But we'll talk first." About expectations. There was no resistance. That's how I knew he'd grown. On Wednesdays, I host tea for women in my neighborhood. No lectures. Just conversation. We talk about deeds. Wills. Boundaries. We laugh more than you'd expect. Because reclaiming your life feels lighter than people think. If you're listening to this and thinking, "It's too late for me," it isn't. Ownership isn't about age. It's about remembering you're allowed to choose. I didn't become cruel. I became clear. And clarity changed everything. In the weeks that followed, I repaired what was damaged. Walls. Shelves. Trust in myself. I didn't repaint immediately. I wanted to see the space as it was before I changed it, to honor what I'd endured. Then I chose new colors. Not bright.
Calm.
The first night I cooked just for myself, I almost made too much. Old habits. Then I laughed. I ate slowly. At my table. In my chair. With the television volume exactly where I wanted it. That moment mattered more than any confrontation. Setting boundaries doesn't end relationships. It reveals them. Some survive. Some don't. That's not cruelty. That's information. Months later, Evan came back, not to move in, not to ask.
Just to talk.
He spoke differently. More carefully. He didn't blame. He reflected. That told me he'd finally started growing. And growth requires discomfort. I had simply stopped absorbing it for him. What I teach now. The women who come to my house for tea don't ask how to be harsh. They ask how to stop feeling guilty. I tell them the same thing every time. Guilt is not a moral compass. It's a habit. And habits can be broken. Love doesn't require self-erasure. Motherhood doesn't cancel ownership. Age doesn't erase authority. And silence, used wisely, is one of the strongest tools a woman has. If you're still listening, it's probably because something in this feels familiar. If that's you, hear this clearly. You're not cruel for wanting respect. You're not selfish for protecting what you built. And you're not late. You're right on time. I didn't expect what came next. When people lose access to comfort they didn't earn, they don't always leave quietly inside. Sometimes they leave emotionally before they leave physically. The house felt tense in those final weeks. Not loud, tight. Like everyone was holding their breath, waiting for me to change my mind. I didn't. Brooke switched strategies. She stopped speaking to me entirely. No greetings. No eye contact. She moved through the house like I wasn't there. It was meant to punish me. But something strange happened. For the first time in years, I felt peaceful in my own home. I realized then that silence only hurts when you're still asking for approval. I wasn't. Evan tried logic. He brought spreadsheets. Talked about future plans. Promised rent soon. I listened, nodded, and said nothing. Finally, he asked, "Don't you trust us?" I answered carefully. Trust isn't the issue. Responsibility is. That ended the conversation. One night, I sat alone in the living room and admitted something I'd avoided for years. I hadn't been helping my son. I had been protecting him from adulthood. Every bill I paid told him he didn't need to stand on his own. Every excuse I made taught him someone else would clean up the mess. That realization hurt more than their disrespect ever did. But pain that clarifies is better than comfort that lies. I went room by room with a notebook. Not angrily.
Practically.
What was mine? What wasn't? I noticed how much of myself I'd minimized to keep the peace. The smaller you make yourself, the more room entitlement takes. I stopped shrinking that day. The night before they were scheduled to leave, Brooke finally spoke to me. She stood in the hallway, arms crossed. "You're tearing this family apart," she said. I met her eyes. "No," I replied calmly. "I'm ending something that was already broken." She didn't have a response for that. Because guilt only works when it's louder than truth. I woke early. Not anxious.
Clear.
They packed in silence. Boxes by the door. Shoes missing from the rack. The house felt like it was exhaling. Evan lingered again. "I thought being family meant automatic forgiveness," he said. I nodded. "It does," I answered. "Not automatic access." That distinction mattered. After they left, I didn't rush to clean. I sat. I listened to the quiet. I noticed how the house sounded different without tension humming through the walls. Later, I opened windows. Light poured in. I realized something simple and profound. Peace doesn't arrive dramatically. It settles. The weeks that followed, I repaired what was damaged. Walls. Shelves. Trust in myself. I didn't repaint immediately. I wanted to see the space as it was before I changed it, to honor what I'd endured. Then I chose new colors. Not bright.
Calm.
The first night I cooked just for myself, I almost made too much. Old habits. Then I laughed. I ate slowly. At my table. In my chair. With the television volume exactly where I wanted it. That moment mattered more than any confrontation. What people don't tell you about boundaries. Setting boundaries doesn't end relationships. It reveals them. Some survive. Some don't. That's not cruelty. That's information. Months later, Evan came back, not to move in, not to ask.
Just to talk.
He spoke differently. More carefully. He didn't blame. He reflected. That told me he'd finally started growing. And growth requires discomfort. I had simply stopped absorbing it for him. The women who come to my house for tea don't ask how to be harsh. They ask how to stop feeling guilty. I tell them the same thing every time. Guilt is not a moral compass. It's a habit. And habits can be broken. Love doesn't require self-erasure. Motherhood doesn't cancel ownership. Age doesn't erase authority. And silence used wisely is one of the strongest tools a woman has. If you're still listening, it's probably because something in this feels familiar. If that's you, hear this clearly. You're not cruel for wanting respect. You're not selfish for protecting what you built. And you're not late. You're right on time. After they left, people assumed I would feel lonely. I didn't. What I felt was space. Not the empty kind, but the kind where your shoulders finally drop because you're no longer bracing for the next small disrespect. I slept deeper than I had in years. Not longer.
Deeper.
The house sounded different without tension living inside the walls. Even the clock ticked softer. For the first time in a long while, I woke up without mentally preparing myself for someone else's mood. That alone was worth everything. A week later, I found the envelope. It was tucked behind a drawer in the hallway cabinet. Old receipts, folded notes, things I didn't recognize. At the bottom was a bank statement printed months earlier. It wasn't mine. I sat at the table and read it slowly. Transfers. Withdrawals. Amounts that didn't match the story I'd been told. That was when I realized something else I hadn't wanted to admit. They hadn't just taken my space. They'd taken advantage of my trust. And I had handed it to them neatly, month after month, believing love meant never asking questions. That day, I didn't cry. I felt embarrassed first, then angry, then very, very clear. I called my attorney again, not to escalate, to confirm. Everything I'd done was right. Legal.
Clean.
That reassurance mattered, not because I doubted myself, but because women my age are taught to. Words spread faster than I expected. Neighbors. Church friends. Distant relatives. Some people praised me quietly. Others said things like, I could never do that to my child. I smiled and nodded. I didn't explain. Because anyone who says that has never lived invisible inside their own home. One afternoon, a woman from down the street knocked on my door.
She was older than me.
Frail hands. Nervous eyes. She said, I heard what you did. I waited. My grandson moved in, she whispered. I don't know how to ask him to leave. I made tea. We sat. And for 2 hours she talked while I listened. At the end, I didn't tell her what to do. I told her what I learned. That you don't need permission to protect yourself. That discomfort is not danger. That saying no once is easier than resenting someone forever.
She cried.
Not because she was scared. Because she felt seen. That became a pattern. One woman turned into two. 2 into 5. Wednesday afternoons filled themselves. No speeches. No advice unless asked. Just women who had given too much, finally hearing it was allowed to stop. Months passed. My son called less often at first. Then more steadily. When he spoke, he listened too. That was new. He didn't talk about his wife much. When he did, it wasn't with anger. Just distance. Distance can be growth. The day he told me they were separating, I didn't feel victorious. I felt sad.
Not for the marriage.
For the years he'd avoided becoming himself. He said, I didn't know how much you were carrying for me. I told him. You weren't meant to know. You were meant to carry your own.
There was no argument after that.
The first time he came over for dinner again, I cooked simple food. We sat at the table, in silence but not the heavy kind. When he reached for his phone out of habit, he stopped himself. That mattered more than words. Later that night, after he left, I washed one plate, one glass, one set of cutlery. I realized something quietly beautiful. My life had finally resized itself to fit me again. I don't tell this story because I'm proud of the pain. I tell it because too many women think endurance is the same as love. It isn't. Love without respect is just slow erosion. And erosion, given enough time, takes everything. If you're listening to this and waiting for the perfect moment to speak up, there isn't one. There is only the moment you decide to stop disappearing. I didn't become hard. I became honest. And honesty gave me my life back. I wake up earlier now. Not because I have to, but because my body finally trusts the morning. There's no rush in my chest, no calculation about who I might disturb. I make my coffee the way I like it, stand by the window, and watch the street come alive without feeling like I owe anyone my silence. It still surprises me how much peace can fit into a small routine. A few weeks after Evan moved out for good, I went through the house slowly, not to clean, but to remember. The hallway where my husband once leaned to tie his shoes. The kitchen corner where my son used to do homework. The chair by the window where I sat through more loneliness than I admitted to myself. I realized something then. I hadn't been afraid of being alone. I'd been afraid of being unnecessary. That fear kept me useful long past the point of being respected. People think control arrives with a single bold moment. It doesn't. It arrives in small, quiet decisions you don't reverse. Like not apologizing when you've done nothing wrong. Like letting someone be disappointed without rushing to fix it. Like trusting your own judgment even when your hands shake a little. Those were the muscles I'd stopped using. Now, they were coming back. One afternoon, I received a letter from Brooke. It was short, careful, polite. She said she hoped I was well, that things had been hard, that she was working on herself. There was no apology. And for the first time, I didn't need one. Closure isn't something someone gives you. It's something you stop chasing. The women who came for tea kept coming. Some stayed quiet for weeks before speaking. Some spoke all at once. Stories of sons who never left. Daughters who took and took. Grandchildren used as leverage. Different details. Same pattern. I never told them what choice to make. I told them what choice cost me years to learn. That you don't owe your future to someone else's comfort. Evan changed in ways I hadn't expected. He started asking questions instead of favors. He talked about his work with pride, not excuses. When he visited, he asked where to sit. That small pause told me everything. One evening, he said, "I used to think you were strong because you never complained." I shook my head gently.
"No," I said.
I was strong when I stopped absorbing things that weren't mine.
He sat with that for a long time.
As the seasons changed, so did the house. Not dramatically. Just enough to feel like me again. Fresh curtains. A repaired shelf. A plant by the window that didn't have to compete for light. The house didn't need to be louder. It needed to breathe. I stopped explaining my decisions to people who didn't live my consequences. That saved me hours of emotional labor I didn't know I was performing. When someone asked, "Don't you miss having everyone around?" I smiled and said, "I enjoy choosing when I'm needed." That usually ended the conversation. There are still moments when memory catches me off guard.
A sound.
A phrase. A chair slightly out of place. But memory no longer controls me.
It informs me.
And that's the difference between grief and growth. I didn't lose my family. I lost an arrangement that required my silence. What remained was something more honest. A relationship with my son that doesn't depend on sacrifice. A home that doesn't ask me to shrink. A life that fits the woman I am now, not the one I was taught to be. If this story sounds quiet, it's because real change usually is. It doesn't announce itself. It settles in, locks the door gently, and finally lets you rest. And rest, I've learned, is not laziness. It's the reward for choosing yourself after a lifetime of choosing everyone else. There was a moment months later when I realized I no longer flinched at my own phone ringing. That might sound small, but for years every call carried a question inside it.
What do they need now?
What am I about to give up? Now the phone rang, and it was just a sound. Sometimes I answered. Sometimes I didn't. And nothing collapsed. I began noticing how much of my life had been shaped around anticipation. Anticipating moods. Anticipating disappointment. Anticipating conflict, so I could soften it before it arrived. Living like that trains you to disappear quietly. When the house emptied, that training didn't vanish overnight. But little by little, the habit loosened its grip. I started making plans again. Not big ones. Simple ones. A walk in the late afternoon. A book finished without interruption. Dinner when I felt hungry, not when it was expected. Each choice felt like a small reclamation. One morning, while organizing old paperwork, I came across my husband's handwriting. A note he'd left inside a folder decades ago. Keep copies. Trust yourself. I sat there for a long time with that paper in my hands. I wondered how long it had been since I truly trusted myself without asking anyone else to confirm it. That note felt like a reminder sent forward in time. The women who gathered on Wednesdays started bringing friends. Not because I advertised, because something about safety travels quietly. They didn't come for advice. They came to sit somewhere they didn't have to explain themselves. We talked about practical things sometimes, documents, accounts, signatures, but more often, we talked about the weight of being needed too much. One woman said, "I thought if I stopped giving, I'd disappear." Another said, "I thought love meant endurance." We sat with those sentences without rushing past them. I noticed something interesting. The moment a woman says out loud what she's been carrying, it loses some of its power. Silence protects harm far more than truth ever does. That realization changed how I spoke everywhere else too. Evan continued to grow, but not in a straight line. Some days he was confident. Other days he sounded unsure, like someone learning how to stand without leaning. I didn't rush to steady him. That was new for both of us. He learned something important in that space. That struggle doesn't mean abandonment. It means ownership. Once he asked me, "Why didn't you say anything sooner?" I answered honestly, "Because I didn't know I was allowed to." We sat quietly after that. Sometimes understanding comes late, but it still matters. I stopped thinking of my story as something dramatic. It wasn't. There was no explosion. No shouting match that fixed everything. There was just a woman who chose clarity over comfort. And that choice kept unfolding. I repainted the dining room last. I saved it on purpose. When the walls were finished and the furniture returned, I stood in the doorway and felt something unexpected. Gratitude. Not for the pain. For the lesson that pain delivered. I learned that boundaries don't harden you. They define you. They tell the world where you end and where others must begin. Without them, love leaks away into obligation. With them, love has shape. Now, when I sit at my table, I don't think about who might object. I think about what I want to read, what I want to hear, how quiet or loud the evening should be. That choice still feels like a gift. If someone listening to this is waiting for permission, I wish I could sit across from you the way those women sat across from me. I would tell you gently what I learned the hard way. You don't need a reason dramatic enough to justify your peace. Discomfort is not a debt you owe. And saying no does not erase love. It reveals whether it was real. My life didn't become smaller when they left. It became precise. And precision, I've discovered, is freedom. I don't mark time the way I used to. There was a period when every day felt like a countdown, waiting for the next request, the next disappointment, the next moment I would have to swallow something I didn't agree with just to keep things calm. Now time moves differently. It stretches instead of presses. One afternoon, I caught myself humming while folding laundry. That stopped me. I stood there, holding a towel, trying to remember the last time I'd done something without tension sitting in my chest. I couldn't. Not because it hadn't happened, but because I'd forgotten what he's felt like. That was when I understood how deeply the old pattern had lived inside me. People ask if I regret anything. I tell them the truth. I regret not listening to myself sooner. I regret believing that love had to hurt to be real. But regret, when you don't live inside it, can be useful. It sharpens you. I began sorting through things I'd kept just in case. Extra chairs. Extra dishes. Extra space reserved for people who no longer needed it. Letting go of objects felt symbolic, but it was also practical. My life didn't need to be arranged around absence anymore. The first holiday alone surprised me. Not because it was lonely, because it wasn't. I cooked what I liked. I ate when I was hungry. I didn't rush. That day taught me something simple. Tradition isn't about repetition. It's about intention. Evan came by a few days later, not to celebrate, just to check in. He noticed the changes. The lighter rooms. The cleared shelves. He smiled and said, "It feels different." "It is," I replied. "Because I am." That wasn't said with bitterness. Just truth. I realized then that growth doesn't announce itself. It shows up in how people adjust around you. In how they ask instead of assume. In how they pause. The women from the neighborhood continued to come. Some stopped after a while. Others stayed. One woman brought documents she'd never opened. Another brought nothing but questions. We didn't rush answers. We talked about what it meant to be tired in a way sleep couldn't fix. That kind of tired only leaves when something changes. I learned how many of us were raised to believe that being needed was the same as being loved. That belief runs deep. Untangling it takes patience. And courage. Sometimes, late at night, I think about the version of myself who sat quietly at the table that evening, sliding her chair back without a word. I wish I could reach across time and tell her something. I would tell her she wasn't weak. She was listening. I don't share this story to inspire applause. I share it because silence isolates people who are already carrying too much. If someone hears this and feels less alone, that's enough. My house is quiet now. Not the lonely kind. The honest kind. The kind that lets you hear yourself think. And for the first time in a long while, when I do, I like what I hear. There are days now when I forget this story ever had sharp edges. Not because it didn't hurt, but because healing doesn't preserve pain the way memory does. It smooths it, softens the corners, leaves the lesson without reopening the wound. That's how I know I've moved forward. I started volunteering at the local records office once a week. Nothing heavy, just helping people find documents, understand forms, untangle paperwork that felt intimidating to them. It felt familiar.
Order has always calmed me.
One afternoon, a woman my age leaned across the counter and whispered, "I don't know what belongs to me anymore." Her voice cracked on the word me. I looked at her and said something I wish someone had said to me years ago. Let's start there. I realized how many people, especially women, slowly disappear into roles without noticing. Mother.
Wife.
Support. Safety net. All honorable things. But none of them are meant to replace your name. At home, I rearranged the living room one last time. Not because it needed it. Because I wanted to. I placed the chair where the light hits in the afternoon and started sitting there with my book instead of watching television. I liked hearing pages turn. It reminded me that stories can move forward without noise. Evan told me one evening that he'd started therapy. He didn't say it proudly or defensively. Just plainly. "I'm learning things," he said. "About myself." I nodded. That was enough. Growth doesn't need an audience. He asked once if I was angry at him. I answered honestly. I was. Then I wasn't. Now I'm just aware. Awareness is lighter than resentment. It lets you move without dragging the past behind you. I stopped introducing myself by what I'd done for others. I stopped saying, "I used to," as if my useful years were behind me. Now, when people ask about me, I say, "I live here. I enjoy my days." That feels like the truest answer. Sometimes in the evenings, I sit on the porch and watch the streetlights come on. Neighbors wave. Children pass by laughing. Life continues, unbothered by the drama we think defines us. That perspective is humbling and freeing. I've learned that boundaries don't make you cold. They make you warm in the right places. They protect what matters so it doesn't burn out. If you're still listening, maybe you recognize yourself somewhere in this. Maybe you're tired in a way rest hasn't fixed. Maybe you're quiet not because you're weak, but because you're deciding. If that's true, trust this. The moment you stop shrinking, the world adjusts. Not always kindly, but always honestly. And honesty, in the end, is what makes room for peace. I didn't lose my family. I found myself. And that, it turns out, was the beginning of everything.